Valorian Dominion had not lost a war in 11,000 years, and Grand Marshal Voss'Kalar Threnn intended to keep it that way with the same casual certainty a man might feel about the sun rising. He stood on the command dais of the dreadnought Absolute Providence, his four-jointed hands clasped behind his back, watching the tactical display bloom with the soft blue light of a star system that, according to every intelligence report his analysts had compiled, contained nothing more dangerous than farmers, miners, and a scattering of orbital scaffolding too primitive to be called defenses. The system was called Kestrel's Reach by its inhabitants, a designation so quaintly provincial that Threnn had actually laughed when he first read it in the mission briefing 3 months earlier, back when the Absolute Providence and its escort of 400 warships had still been 6 jumps away, gathering strength like a storm rolling in over a defenseless coastline. The Valorian Dominion did not send 400 warships to conquer farmers. They sent 400 warships because 400 warships was simply how the Dominion did things, an overwhelming, theatrical, almost operatic display of force meant to break the will of any species before the first shot was fired. It had worked on the Ashendari. It had worked on the Corvex Trade Compact. It had worked, with only minor and forgettable resistance, on 11 other spacefaring civilizations across 3 galactic arms, each of them folded into the Dominion's sprawling hierarchy of tribute states and client worlds, their populations reorganized, their industries repurposed, their histories quietly erased from the official record and replaced with a gentler narrative in which the Dominion had always been there, benevolent and eternal. Humanity, according to the intelligence dossier stamped with the seal of the Dominion's Bureau of Xenological Assessment, was rated a Class 5 minimal threat, the second lowest classification on a 7-tier scale, 1 notch above species that had not yet developed fire. The assessment cited humanity's brief, chaotic history of interstellar expansion, a mere 3 centuries compared to the Dominion's 11 millennia, their fractured political structures, their reliance on chemical and fusion propulsion that Valorian engineers considered charmingly obsolete, and the report noted with something close to contempt their apparent cultural obsession with irony, humor, and self-deprecation. Traits the Bureau's analysts had flagged as evidence of a species that did not take its own survival seriously. Threnn had read that particular line to his senior officers over dinner the night before translation into the Kestrel's Reach system, and the wardroom had erupted into the low, rasping laughter that passed for amusement among the Valorian officer caste. A species that joked about its own extinction was not a species that would fight hard to prevent it. This was doctrine, drilled into every Valorian cadet from the moment they entered the war academies on the homeworld of Valos Prime. Confidence broke enemies before weapons did, and an enemy that mocked itself had already surrendered in spirit, whatever posturing its diplomats might offer in the final hours. Threnn believed this the way he believed the stars would still be burning tomorrow. He had built a 40-year career on that belief, rising from a junior tactical officer aboard a border cruiser to the youngest Grand Marshal in 3 centuries, and he saw no reason Kestrel's Reach would be the engagement that proved him wrong. It was, if anything, beneath his talents. He had petitioned the Dominion's War Council for a more prestigious assignment, something worthy of the Absolute Providence and its escort, but the Council had insisted that a show of overwhelming force against even a minor threat served a purpose. It reminded the newer client species along the Dominion's expanding frontier exactly what awaited anyone foolish enough to resist. Kestrel's Reach was not a war. It was a demonstration, a piece of theater staged for an audience of 1,000 watching worlds, and Threnn intended to perform it flawlessly. Every Dominion warship carried, etched somewhere upon its hull in the old ceremonial script, a fragment of the same founding oath sworn by the first Valorian war fleet to leave the surface of Valos Prime 11,000 years earlier, that no enemy would ever again dictate the terms of a Valorian's death. It was a promise the Dominion had kept, campaign after campaign, world after world, for so long that it had ceased to feel like a promise at all, and had instead calcified into something closer to physical law, as immutable and unquestioned as gravity or the speed of light. Threnn had grown up beneath that promise. He had been raised on stories of the Ashendari surrender, of the Corvex capitulation, of 100 lesser conquests folded so seamlessly into Dominion history that most citizens of Valos Prime no longer remembered a time when those worlds had been anything other than provinces of the Dominion. He had never once, in 40 years of service, questioned whether that promise might someday be broken, because the entire architecture of his career, his training, his very sense of self, had been built atop the assumption that it could not be. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace in a formation so vast it darkened the light of the system's yellow star for the sensors of anyone watching from the surface of the colony's single habitable world, a temperate blue-green planet the humans called New Harrow. 400 warships unfolded across the dark in concentric rings of iron and fire, the towering wedge-shaped dreadnoughts of the 1st Assault Legion, each one 3 kilometers of armored hull bristling with plasma lances and gravitic disruptor arrays. The swarming clouds of interceptor wings, small enough to be lost against the void, yet numerous enough to blot out a star. The slow, ponderous bulk of the siege carriers, each one capable of dropping 100,000 ground troops onto a contested world within a single planetary rotation. And at the absolute center of the formation, largest of them all, the absolute Providence itself, a spear of black and gold 4 kilometers from bow to stern, its hull etched with the victory glyphs of 11,000 years of Dominion conquest, so numerous that the ship's designers had long ago run out of surface area and begun etching them in miniature, layered atop one another like the rings of some impossibly ancient tree. Flanking the flagship in a tight, ceremonial diamond were the 4 Sentinel-class battlecruisers of Threnn's personal honor guard, each one 1.5 kilometers of layered adamantine plating wrapped around a reactor core capable of powering a mid-sized city, their prow-mounted disruptor arrays gleaming with the dull violet light of weapons that had, between them, ended the independent existence of no fewer than 9 spacefaring civilizations. Behind this inner formation churned the true bulk of the invasion force. 80 Warbringer-class heavy cruisers arranged in overlapping defensive lattices, their hulls a matte, light-heating black designed to intimidate rather than conceal, followed by the slow, almost lazy drift of the 6 siege carriers, vast flattened cylinders 2 kilometers across whose lower hulls bristled with drop pod bays capable of delivering an entire planetary occupation force before local defenders could so much as organize a response. Threading between these larger vessels and vastly outnumbering them, moved the interceptor wings, over 12,000 single-crew fighters distributed across 60 carrier groups, their hulls painted in the burnished copper of the 1st Assault Legion, moving in tight formations that had been drilled into their pilots since childhood academy and had, by this point in Dominion history, become less a tactic than a kind of martial choreography. Beautiful and terrible in equal measure to watch unfold against the dark. Threnn had commissioned an artist, once, early in his tenure as Grand Marshal, to render the fleet's standard invasion formation as a single continuous image, and the resulting canvas, now displayed in the officers' mess of every ship under his command, depicted the absolute Providence and its escort as a closed fist descending toward a helpless world, fingers of steel curling inward around a planet rendered in soft, vulnerable blues and greens. It was meant as inspiration. It had never once, in the 11 campaigns since its unveiling, needed to be more than that, because no enemy fleet had ever survived long enough to test whether the closed fist could, in fact, be forced back open. The visual alone, Threnn knew, would have been enough to end most wars before they began. He had seen it happen a dozen times. A fleet materializes in a system's outer dark, its scale so absurd, so mathematically unreasonable that the defending world's government simply capitulates within hours, sparing their people the fire that would otherwise fall from the sky like judgment. He expected the same here. His censor officer reported the human colony's orbital infrastructure within minutes of translation. A scattering of what appeared to be communication relays, a handful of fuel depots serving the modest asteroid mining operations in the system's outer belt, an orbital shipyard clearly built for civilian freighters rather than warships, and a thin ring of what the Bureau's dossier described as obsolete point defense platforms, relics of some earlier era of human paranoia that the analysts judged incapable of meaningfully damaging even a single Valorian escort frigate. There was no visible battle fleet. There was no visible resistance of any kind. New Harrow's largest city, a sprawling grid of glass and steel called Meridian, pulsed with the mundane light of civilian traffic, utterly unbothered, as though 400 warships had not just eclipsed its sun. Threnn found this almost insulting. He had expected panic, evacuation convoys scattering for the system's jump points, perhaps a token gesture of defiance from whatever passed for a human colonial militia. Instead, New Harrow's planetary network continued broadcasting what his linguistics officers translated as commercial entertainment programming, sports commentary, and what appeared to be a weather forecast, as though the arrival of an armada capable of sterilizing the planet's surface 12 times over was a matter of no particular consequence. "Perhaps they have not yet processed what they are looking at," suggested Fleet Commander Ashel Vane, Threnn's second-in-command, a grizzled veteran of the Corvex campaign whose face bore the ritual battle scars of 40 years of Dominion service. Primitives often fail to comprehend scale until the scale is explained to them in terms they understand. "Then let us explain it," Threnn said, and gave the order that had opened every Dominion conquest for 11,000 years. Transmit the ultimatum. The message went out on every frequency New Harrow's networks were broadcasting on, a calculated act of psychological warfare as much as diplomacy, designed to interrupt every screen, every device, every moment of ordinary human life with the unmistakable image of Grand Marshal Threnn's four-eyed, iron-gray face filling their displays like an eclipse. The translation matrix rendered his words into flawless colloquial English, a courtesy the Dominion extended to species it considered worth the effort of conquering cleanly rather than simply burning from orbit. "People of New Harrow," the message began, in the same measured, almost gentle tone Threnn had used to open 112 prior campaigns. "I am Grand Marshal Voss'Kalar Threnn of the Valorian Dominion. Your system now falls within the sovereign expansion boundary of Dominion territory. You have no military capacity to resist the force currently in orbit above your world. Surrender your governance structures within 6 hours and your civilian population will be integrated into the Dominion's protectorate system with minimal disruption to daily life. Resist, and this system will be reduced to debris within the same time frame. The choice, as it has been for every species that came before you, belongs entirely to you." He expected panic. He expected pleading transmissions from planetary officials, frantic requests for terms, perhaps a doomed and pitiable attempt to scramble what few armed ships the colony possessed into some symbolic show of defiance that his fleet would swat aside in minutes, purely for the benefit of the watching client worlds recording the engagement for propaganda purposes. What he received, 17 minutes later, was a single response, transmitted not from any planetary government building, but from a modest communications array on the outskirts of Meridian, spoken by a woman whose voice carried none of the fear his translation matrix's emotional analysis subroutines had been trained to detect. "Grand Marshal Threnn," the voice said, calm as still water, "this is Fleet Admiral Elena Reyes, Joint Colonial Defense Command, New Harrow Station. We've received your message. Give us a moment to discuss it among ourselves." The transmission cut. Threnn stared at the dead channel for a long moment, an unfamiliar sensation prickling at the edges of his composure, something he would not have named as unease because Valorian Grand Marshals did not experience unease in the face of Class 5 minimal threats, but which resembled it closely enough that Vane noticed the subtle tightening around his commander's eyes. "A fleet admiral," Vane said slowly, testing the rank designation. "The Bureau's dossier made no mention of a standing human fleet in this system." "The Bureau's dossier," Threnn replied, "made no mention of a great many things, apparently." He straightened, dismissing the flicker of doubt as unworthy of a Grand Marshal of his experience. Every species postured before surrendering. It was a matter of dignity, a final performance of defiance before the inevitable capitulation, and human psychology, according to 11 separate anthropological surveys compiled over the 3 decades since first contact, was particularly prone to exactly this kind of theatrical bravado. He had seen it from 100 dying civilizations. The brave words, the invocation of grand-sounding titles, the desperate hope that confidence alone might substitute for firepower. "Let them have their moment of pride, Commander. It changes nothing. Position the 2nd and 3rd Legions to begin orbital bombardment preparations. If they have not formally surrendered within the 6-hour window, we proceed as planned." What Grand Marshal Threnn did not know, could not have known, was that 17 minutes was precisely the amount of time Fleet A. Admiral Elena Reyes needed to confirm that the Valorian fleet's sensor sweep patterns matched the predictive models her intelligence division had built over the preceding 4 years. Ever since the first faint, jury-rigged deep space listening posts strung along New Harrow's outer belt had detected the characteristic gravitic signature of a Dominion scout vessel conducting a reconnaissance pass through the system's edge. 4 years. That was how long humanity had known the Valorian Dominion existed, how long its analysts had studied the wreckage of a single-down Dominion drone recovered from the ice moons of the system's gas giant, reverse engineering its sensor suite, its communications protocols, its weapons signatures, piece by piece, in the buried research facilities beneath Meridian that no orbital scan, however sophisticated, would ever detect from 400 kilometers up. 4 years during which New Harrow had transformed itself from a modest, 30,000-person mining and agricultural colony into something the Dominion's Bureau of Xenological Assessment, for all its 11,000 years of accumulated conquest doctrine, had never once imagined. A trap built with the patience of a species that understood, in its bones, that it could not win a war of scale against an empire 11 millennia old, and so had built, instead, a war of deception. Every one of those obsolete point defense platforms, scattered in a thin ring around New Harrow, was, in fact, a Hammerfall-class orbital rail cannon, its true nature buried beneath layers of camouflage plating and deliberately falsified sensor emissions, engineered by New Harrow's small but ferociously talented core of electronic warfare specialists to mimic the heat and radiation signature of decommissioned, low-power equipment. Each platform housed a magnetic accelerator 400 meters long, capable of hurling a half-ton depleted uranium slug to 12% of light speed, an impact energy equivalent to a small tactical nuclear detonation, concentrated into a point of kinetic force no energy shield in the Dominion's arsenal had ever been designed to stop, because no species the Dominion had ever fought possessed the industrial capacity. The sheer bloody-minded willingness to spend a decade's GDP on colony defense to build weapons like these. The civilian shipyard, in high orbit above Meridian, was not building freighters. It had not built a single freighter in 3 years. Its docking cradles, disguised beneath spoofed hull registries and holographic paneling that rendered them invisible to anything but a physical boarding inspection, held the skeletal, half-assembled frames of the Reaper-class strike carriers that would, within hours, become the single deadliest surprise the Valorian Dominion had encountered in 11,000 years of uncontested war. And beyond the shipyard, beyond the thin ring of disguised rail platforms, out past the orbit of New Harrow's single moon, past the asteroid belt where human miners went about their unremarkable business under the watchful, disinterested gaze of Valorian sensor operators who saw nothing worth reporting, the system's massive gas giant. A swirling amber endrust whirled the colonists called Old Faithful for its startlingly regular storm cycles. Hid something the Dominion's intelligence services had never once considered, because no species in the galaxy's recorded history had ever attempted it at this scale. An entire stealth battle fleet, 312 vessels strong, tucked into the deep radiation shadow of the gas giant's magnetosphere, their hulls coated in adaptive metamaterial plating that bent incoming sensor pulses around their mass with an efficiency Dominion engineers, had they somehow acquired a sample, would have needed a decade to reverse engineer. The fleet had sat there, powered down to the barest minimum life support thresholds, running silent for 6 months, ever since New Harrow's Deep Space Early Warning Network first flagged the Absolute Providence's approach vector from 3 systems away. 6 months of drills conducted in absolute radio silence, 6 months of crews sleeping in shifts beside weapons systems. They were forbidden to so much as power cycle for fear of a stray energy signature betraying their position. 6 months of waiting, with the particular patience of a species that had spent the entirety of its recorded history at war with itself, and had, in the process, become extraordinarily good at it. Admiral Elena Reyes had not spent 17 minutes deliberating with a planetary council, because there was no planetary council to deliberate with in any sense the Dominion would have recognized. New Harrow's civilian government, a modest elected body of 11 representatives, had been briefed on the colony's true defensive posture only in the broadest terms, on a strict need-to-know basis, 4 years earlier, and had unanimously voted to grant full tactical authority to Joint Colonial Defense Command for the duration of any confirmed first contact hostile engagement. The 17 minutes had been spent confirming 3 things. First, that the Valorian fleet's approach vector and formation matched the doctrine profile her intelligence division had modeled from captured Dominion communications intercepted over the preceding 2 years by a network of automated listening posts scattered discreetly through 6 neighboring systems. Second, that the fleet showed no indication of having detected the gas giant's hidden battle group, evidenced by the complete absence of any reconnaissance drones dispatched toward Old Faithful's orbit, a fact that confirmed the Dominion's sensor doctrine relied almost entirely on passive long-range sweeps rather than close physical verification, a doctrine born of 11,000 years of never once needing to look twice. And third, that every asset in her arsenal, every rail platform, every hidden carrier, every one of the drone swarms currently dormant in numbered storage silos buried beneath New Harrow's agricultural plains, was armed, calibrated, and waiting. When she reopened the channel to the Absolute Providence, her voice carried the same unhurried calm it had before, a calm that Threnn's emotional analysis subroutines flagged, with mounting and unacknowledged confusion, as genuine rather than performed. "Grand Marshal Threnn," she said, "New Harrow's civilian government has authorized me to communicate our position. We don't recognize the Dominion's claim to this system. We won't be surrendering." Threnn actually smiled, an expression that showed rows of small, serrated teeth, the closest a Valorian face came to genuine amusement. "Admiral Reyes," he said, and he made a point of using her rank, a small courtesy for a doomed adversary who had at least provided some theatrical entertainment before the inevitable. "I admire the performance, truly, but performance is all it can be. You command, at most, a handful of decommissioned point defense emplacements and a civilian population with no combat experience against a fleet that has ended 11 previous wars without losing a single capital ship. I will give you one final opportunity. Withdraw your forces from any offensive posture, transmit a formal surrender to my flagship, and I will personally guarantee the safety of every human being on that planet's surface." Refuse, and I promise you, Admiral, this will not be remembered as a battle. It will be remembered as a demonstration." "Funny," Reyes replied, and something in her tone made Vane's scarred face tighten with the first genuine flicker of concern he had shown since translation. "We were about to say the exact same thing to you." The channel went dead, and for the space of 11 seconds, nothing happened at all. 11 seconds during which Threnn allowed himself the small, private satisfaction of assuming the human admiral's bravado had finally cracked under the weight of the inevitable. That some final override command was even now being transmitted to whatever pathetic defensive assets New Harrow possessed, ordering them to stand down before the Dominion's fleet reduced them to orbital debris. He was still holding that thought, still savoring the particular flavor of a war won without a shot fired, when New Harrow's entire ring of obsolete point defense platforms shed their camouflage plating in a single synchronized pulse of releasing bolts and flash-severed cabling, and the Absolute Providence's forward sensor array lit up with 411 separate Priority 1 threat alerts within the span of a heartbeat. The Hammerfall rail platforms did not look like weapons of war. Even now, with their disguise plating jettisoned and drifting away in glittering, tumbling debris, they looked more like industrial equipment than warships, squat and utilitarian, entirely lacking the aggressive, angular menace of a Dominion battle cruiser. This aesthetic mundanity was, Threnn would understand only much later, entirely deliberate, a species that had learned, through 3 centuries of its own brutal internal wars, that the deadliest weapons were rarely the ones that looked deadly, had built its planetary defense network to look like exactly what the Bureau of Xenological Assessment had assumed it to be. Leftover infrastructure from a poorer, less advanced era, unworthy of a second glance. The first volley fired 41 seconds after the platforms revealed themselves, and it was aimed not at the swarming interceptor wings or the ponderous siege carriers, but at the 4 escort cruisers positioned in the Absolute Providence's immediate defensive screen, the ships whose energy shields were tasked with absorbing exactly this kind of concentrated kinetic strike. The shields did not absorb it. A half-ton slug of depleted uranium traveling at 12% of light speed carries a kinetic energy that does not care about the elegant, layered defensive doctrine of an 11,000-year-old empire. It carries only its own brutal, uncomplicated physics, and when the first slug struck the shield envelope of the escort cruiser Undying Resolve, the resulting release of energy did not merely overwhelm the shield generators. It obliterated them, along with the forward third of the ship, in a silent, soundless bloom of white fire that Threnn watched unfold on his tactical display, with an expression his officers had never once seen on his face before: astonishment. The Undying Resolve, a 400-meter cruiser that had served the Dominion faithfully through 3 prior campaigns, folded in on itself like crumpled paper and began venting atmosphere and burning fuel into the vacuum in a widening, glittering cloud. Its death so sudden and so total that its crew of 211 Valorian sailors had no time to so much as register an emergency alert before they were simply, irrevocably gone. 3 more slugs found their marks within the same 11-second window, and 3 more escort cruisers died in the same terrible, silent fashion, their hulls punched through and through by kinetic force that no shield technology the Dominion possessed had ever been designed to withstand, because no species the Dominion had ever fought had possessed the industrial willpower to build weapons on this scale purely for planetary defense. Threnn's tactical officers scrambled to reclassify the threat, their trained assessments crumbling in real time as the obsolete point defense platforms continued firing in a rolling, staggered barrage designed to maximize target saturation, each rail cannon cycling through a magnetic recharge sequence that took 90 seconds between shots but which, distributed across 411 separate platforms firing in coordinated sequence, produced an effectively continuous curtain of kinetic fire, sweeping through the Dominion's forward formation like a scythe through wheat. Evasive maneuvers all ships immediately. Vane's voice cracked with an urgency that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier, and across the vast formation of 400 Dominion warships, helm officers who had spent their entire careers executing textbook Dominion battle doctrine, tight, disciplined formations designed to concentrate defensive fire and present a unified, overwhelming front, found themselves attempting, for the first time in living memory, to break formation under fire from an enemy their intelligence services had rated a Class 5 minimal threat. The result was chaos. Ships that had trained for decades to move in perfect synchronized formation now scattered in directions dictated more by panic than tactics. And in that scattering, in that sudden loss of the disciplined defensive geometry that had won the Dominion 11,000 years of uncontested war, new Harrow's rail platforms found even more targets, their fire control systems, a distributed, redundant network that Reyes' engineers had spent 2 years perfecting specifically to counter exactly this kind of adaptive enemy maneuvering, recalculating firing solutions in fractions of a second, tracking ships that had never in their operational histories needed to worry about being tracked. Threnn watched his tactical display transform from an orderly grid of green Dominion icons into a chaotic, bleeding wound of red damage indicators and black wreckage markers, and for the first time in his 40-year career, he felt something he had no ready name for, a cold, hollow sensation that began somewhere behind his sternum and spread outward with each new casualty report. 6 ships lost, then 9, then 14. The destroyer Iron Faith taking a direct hit amidships that folded its keel and sent it tumbling, spilling escape pods that tumbled uselessly into the dark, because no rescue vessel in the fleet had time to attempt recovery, while the rail platforms continued their merciless, methodical work. "Return fire," Threnn barked, his composure fracturing at the edges. "All batteries target those platforms. I want them silenced within the minute." The Absolute Providence's own weapons batteries, plasma lances capable of vaporizing a mountain range in a single sustained discharge, swung to bear on the nearest rail platforms and opened fire. And here, finally, the Dominion's technological superiority reasserted itself in a way that offered Threnn a small, grim measure of relief. The plasma lances tore through 3 of the platforms in quick succession, superheated matter boiling away armor plating that, disguised as it had been, was never meant to withstand direct engagement from a capital ship's primary batteries. But 3 platforms out of 411 was a statistic that offered no comfort at all. And even as the Absolute Providence's gunners cheered their small victory, New Harrow's remaining platforms adjusted their fire distribution, concentrating separate rail cannons on each surviving Dominion capital ship in a coordinated barrage, designed specifically to overwhelm even the most heavily shielded targets. A tactic Reyes' fire control algorithms had wargamed against exactly this kind of Dominion Dreadnought-class shield, rating for 3 straight years in simulation. And then, as if the rail platforms alone were not catastrophe enough, New Harrow's disguised orbital shipyard shed its own camouflage in a violent cascade of jettisoned paneling, and the half-assembled hull's Threnn's sensors had catalogued as unfinished civilian freighters revealed themselves as something far more dangerous. 8 Reaper-class strike carriers, their launch bays already cycling open, disgorging swarms of autonomous combat drones in numbers that made Threnn's sensor operators, for one horrified moment, simply stop reporting numbers at all because the numbers had stopped meaning anything useful. Each Reaper carrier held 2,000 drones, small, fast, expendable craft barely larger than an escape pod, each one carrying a modest but sufficient payload of shape-charge warheads, and a targeting computer sophisticated enough to identify and exploit the specific structural weak points of Valorian hull architecture. Weak points that New Harrow's intelligence division had spent 4 years cataloging from captured sensor data and painstaking analysis of the downed reconnaissance drone, that had started this entire desperate, brilliant defensive project. 16,000 drones poured into the dark in the span of 90 seconds, a swarm so dense it registered on Dominion sensors as a solid, moving wall rather than 16,000 individual contacts, and they did not fly in the wide, sweeping attack runs Dominion doctrine expected of enemy strike craft. They flew low, fast, and erratic, weaving through the chaotic scatter of the Dominion's broken formation with a coordinated, almost organic fluidity that Threnn's tactical AI, straining to process the sheer volume of independent threat vectors, could only describe as swarm behavior consistent with distributed autonomous coordination, origin unknown, threat classification revised to critical. The drones targeted engine housings, sensor arrays, and weapon emplacements with surgical, merciless precision, sacrificing themselves in bursts of shape-charge fire that, individually, could not have scratched a Dominion cruiser's armor, but which, delivered in swarms of dozens against a single point of impact, tore through shield envelopes already weakened by rail cannon fire and burrowed into the vulnerable machinery beneath. The Dominion's 12,000 interceptors scrambled to meet the swarm, and for a brief, chaotic span of minutes the space around the Absolute Providence's forward screen became a churning storm of point defense fire and counter-maneuvering fighters, streaks of copper and dull violet weaving between the smaller, faster human drones in a battle that any outside observer would have called, on paper, hopelessly lopsided in the Dominion's favor. Individually, a Valorian interceptor was a far more capable machine than a single expendable human drone, faster, better armored, flown by a pilot with a decade of academy training, rather than an autonomous targeting computer running inference on a battlefield model. But New Harrow's drones had never been designed to win individual engagements. They had been designed, from their very first line of programming, to win a war of arithmetic, and arithmetic did not care about the individual skill of a Valorian pilot who suddenly found himself facing not one opponent but 11, converging from 11 different vectors, only 3 or 4 of which his targeting systems could resolve and engage before the others closed the distance and detonated. Entire interceptor wings vanished within minutes, their pilots managing, at best, to take 4 or 5 drones apiece before the sheer weight of numbers overwhelmed them, and the survivors who limped back toward their carriers did so through a debris field already thick with the tumbling wreckage of ships that, 6 hours earlier, had represented the single most feared strike arm in this quadrant of known space. Threnn watched the interceptor wings die in real time, watched pilot after pilot transmit brief, garbled distress calls before their signals simply stopped, and understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to be of any use, that his enemy had not built 16,000 drones to fight a battle of quality. They had built 16,000 drones because they had correctly calculated, months or years in advance, exactly how many expendable machines it would take to overwhelm the finest fighter wings the Dominion could field, and had built precisely that number, with the same cold, unsentimental arithmetic a human accountant might apply to a balance sheet. There was something almost obscene about it, Threnn thought, this reductio n of war to spreadsheet calculation, and yet he could find no flaw in the logic, no error in the execution, nothing at all to suggest that the humans on the other end of this engagement had left anything to chance. Grand Marshal, the 2nd Legion's forward screen is disintegrating, Vane reported, his voice stripped of the ritual formality Valorian officers were trained to maintain even in crisis. We are losing ships faster than I can report them. Threnn stared at the display, at the spreading red bloom of destruction consuming a fleet that had, 4 hours earlier, seemed as inevitable and unstoppable as gravity itself, and he felt the first genuine crack in 11,000 years of Dominion certainty open somewhere beneath his ribs. "This is not possible," he said, and he heard distantly how thin his own voice sounded. "This is not possible. They are a Class 5 minimal threat." "Grand Marshal," Vane said, and something in his tone made Threnn turn to look at him directly. "I do not believe the Bureau's assessment was correct." It was, Threnn would later reflect in the long, humiliating hours that followed, perhaps the single greatest understatement in the recorded history of Dominion military communications. Because the battle, terrible as it already was, had not yet truly begun. Fleet Admiral Elena Reyes, watching the engagement unfold from the reinforced command bunker 300 meters beneath Meridian Civic Center, had spent the preceding 4 hours doing precisely nothing to reveal the single largest asset in New Harrow's defensive arsenal, because a trap sprung too early is merely an ambush, and Reyes had not built an ambush. She had built an execution. "Rail platforms and drone wings have done exactly what we modeled," reported Commodore Adiz Okonkwo, Reyes' chief tactical officer, watching the same feed from a console beside the Admiral's own. "Enemy formation cohesion has collapsed. They're bleeding ships at a rate their command structure isn't equipped to process. Recommend we commit the reserve fleet now, while their sensor net is still saturated with drone contacts and can't properly resolve new threat vectors." "Do it," Reyes said, and there was nothing triumphant in her voice, nothing that resembled the vindictive satisfaction a lesser commander might have allowed herself after 4 years of grinding, uncertain preparation for a war she had no way of knowing would ever actually come. There was only the flat, professional calm of a woman executing a plan exactly as designed. "All ships, Task Force Kestrel, execute ambush pattern Delta. Rail platforms, maintain fire discipline, continue target saturation on capital-class contacts. Drone wings 1 through 8, shift target priority to point defense emplacements. I want their remaining ships blind before the stealth fleet arrives." 312 kilometers away, in the deep radiation shadow of Old Faithful's churning amber storms, the hidden fleet that had waited 6 months in silent, disciplined patience received the activation signal and came alive in a way that no Valorian sensor operator, however skilled, however experienced, was equipped to detect until it was already far too late. The Reyes Doctrine, as it would come to be known in the Tactical Academy's humanity, would build in the decades following this battle, called for stealth assets to remain in absolute passive silence until the enemy's attention, sensor resources, and cognitive bandwidth were maximally consumed by an existing crisis, and only then to strike, not from the flank or the rear where an alert enemy might anticipate a reserve force, but directly through the heart of the chaos the enemy was already failing to process. 312 vessels, 60 Vanguard-class heavy cruisers armed with nuclear-pumped X-ray laser batteries, 140 Wraith-class stealth frigates carrying the second wave of drone reinforcements, and at the fleet's core, the 12 Leviathan-class battlecruisers that represented humanity's single greatest investment of industrial capacity since the founding of the new Harrow colony itself. Broke from the gas giant's magnetic shadow in a formation calculated to strike the Dominion fleet's flank at the precise moment. Its command structure was already reeling from the rail cannon barrage, and the drone swarms opening assault. The nuclear-pumped lasers were, in their way, the single most terrifying weapon in New Harrow's arsenal, and not merely for their raw destructive power, though that power was formidable enough. Each Vanguard-class cruiser carried a magazine of specialized warheads, each one a small tactical nuclear device, wrapped in an array of lasing rods that converted the detonation's initial energy release into a single, coherent, devastating beam of X-ray radiation before the weapon's own destruction. A one-shot, one-kill system that traded a portion of the warhead's total yield for a beam capable of punching through even the Dominion's heaviest capital ship armor at ranges that made conventional plasma lance combat look like a schoolyard brawl by comparison. The weapon was expensive, difficult to manufacture, and utterly unsuited to sustained engagement, a fact New Harrow's naval architects had understood from the earliest design phase, which was precisely why the Vanguard cruisers had been built not as a primary battle line, but as an ambush weapon, a single devastating alpha strike meant to be unleashed exactly once, in exactly the right moment, against exactly the right targets. That moment arrived 11 minutes into the engagement, as the 12 Leviathan battlecruisers and their 60 Vanguard escorts crossed the threshold of New Harrow's outer defensive perimeter and opened fire on the Dominion fleet's flank in a single, synchronized volley that Threnn, watching his tactical display with the numb, disbelieving horror of a man watching his entire understanding of the universe come apart in real time, would later describe to Dominion war crimes investigators as the moment I understood that we had already lost, and had likely lost before we ever arrived in this system. 60 nuclear-pumped X-ray lasers fired within the same 3-second window, each beam finding a target with a precision that spoke of months, perhaps years, of painstaking simulation and rehearsal, and 60 Dominion warships, cruisers, destroyers, two of the massive siege carriers that had been intended to deliver the Dominion's occupation force to New Harrow's surface, died in that single volley. Their armor punched through by radiation beams that reduced entire compartments to superheated plasma in fractions of a second, their crews dead before their own damage control systems could register the initial impact. "Grand Marshal," Vane said, and his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, "we have lost 61 ships in the last 4 minutes. Sensor contact confirms a second enemy fleet, previously undetected, of no less than 300 vessels, emerging from the gas giant's magnetic shadow. Enemy stealth technology exceeds all prior Dominion intelligence estimates." Threnn said nothing. He stood on the command dais of the Absolute Providence, watching his tactical display transform, ship by ship, kill by kill, from the orderly green grid of an unstoppable armada into a chaotic, bleeding field of red destruction markers and black wreckage icons. And he felt, for the first time in 11,000 years of Dominion military history, though he did not yet know this, would not know it until the long, humiliating debriefings that followed, the particular vertigo of a species discovering that its most fundamental assumption about its own supremacy had been not merely wrong, but catastrophically, existentially wrong. The Bureau of Xenological Assessment had rated humanity a Class 5 minimal threat based on 3 centuries of chaotic, decentralized expansion, based on a species that joked about its own mortality and fought amongst itself with a frequency the Bureau's analysts had interpreted as weakness rather than what it actually was. 3 centuries of humanity's entire history compressed into an unbroken, brutal apprenticeship in the art and science of organized violence, an apprenticeship the Dominion, secure in 11,000 years of uncontested dominance, had simply never had cause to undertake. The battle that followed, and it would be remembered, in the tactical histories both human and Valorian scholars would write in the decades to come, as the Battle of Kestrel's Reach, the engagement that first taught the galaxy to fear the word human, unfolded across the following 90 minutes with a brutal, methodical inevitability that Threnn, watching from the command dais of a flagship increasingly isolated within its own disintegrating formation, could only describe to himself as watching a species execute, with cold and total precision, exactly the plan it had spent 4 years building. The Leviathan battlecruisers, having delivered their opening nuclear pump strike, folded back into a supporting role, their heavier conventional weapons, massive coilgun batteries, firing depleted uranium penetrator rounds at a rate of 40 shots per minute per ship, grinding down the surviving Dominion capital ships in a sustained, punishing barrage that no amount of Valorian engineering excellence could fully absorb. The Wraith-class stealth frigates, meanwhile, deployed their own drone reinforcements, a second wave of 12,000 autonomous strike craft that swept into the gaps the first wave had already torn in the Dominion's defensive cohesion, and the combined weight of nearly 30,000 drones, operating across a battlespace now saturated with wreckage, radiation, and the confused, panicked communications of a fleet whose command structure had never once trained for a scenario in which the enemy passes. Said superior information, technology, and tactical coordination produced a rate of attrition that Dominion military historians would spend the following decade trying, and largely failing, to fully explain to a public that had been raised on 11,000 years of unbroken victory. Threnn attempted, in those first desperate minutes, to salvage what remained of Dominion battle doctrine, ordering the surviving elements of the 1st and 3rd Legions to consolidate into a defensive sphere around the Absolute Providence, a formation designed to concentrate the fleet's remaining firepower and shield capacity into a single, hardened point that even new Harrow's devastating combined arms might struggle to crack. It was, in its way, the correct tactical response, the kind of disciplined, textbook adaptation that had salvaged half a dozen prior Dominion engagements from the brink of disaster, and for a brief, agonizing stretch of 9 minutes, it appeared to be working. The consolidated sphere's overlapping shield envelopes began absorbing drone strikes and rail cannon fire with markedly improved efficiency, and the Absolute Providence's own devastating broadside, 40 plasma lances firing in concentrated sequence, tore through 3 of the Wraith-class frigates that had strayed too close to the formation's outer edge. But Elena Reyes had not spent 4 years building a defensive network without also studying, in exhaustive, obsessive detail, exactly this kind of Dominion consolidation doctrine, drawn from every scrap of intercepted communication and captured sensor data her intelligence division had managed to accumulate from 6 years of quiet, careful eavesdropping on Dominion military channels across the wider region. "They're forming a defensive sphere," Commodore Okonkwo reported from the Meridian command bunker, watching the tactical display with an expression that carried no surprise at all, because this too had been modeled, war-gamed, and rehearsed. "Recommend Vanguard cruisers reload nuclear-pumped batteries and target formation cohesion directly. Take out the anchor ships holding the sphere's shield geometry together, and the whole structure collapses." "Do it," Reyes said, and the order went out, and 8 minutes later the Vanguard cruisers unleashed their second and final nuclear-pumped volley, this one concentrated not across the broad spread of the Dominion fleet, but on the 6 specific cruisers Reyes's tactical analysts had identified, through careful observation of the sphere's shield overlap patterns, as the structural anchors of the entire defensive formation. All 6 died within the same 3-second window, and without their shield contribution, the overlapping envelope that had briefly given the surviving Dominion fleet a fighting chance simply came apart, exposing the Absolute Providence and its remaining escorts to the full, unmitigated fury of rail cannon fire, drone strikes, and coilgun barrages that had, until that moment, been distributed across a much larger and more resilient target array. It was in the collapse of that formation, in the 90 seconds that followed the failure of the defensive sphere, that Grand Marshal Voss'Kalar Threnn finally, fully understood the shape of the disaster he commanded, and the understanding arrived with a physical force he had never once experienced in 40 years of otherwise uninterrupted victory. His tactical display, which had opened the engagement showing 400 confident green icons arrayed in the disciplined, overwhelming geometry of Dominion battle doctrine, now showed 63 ships still capable of independent maneuver, scattered, isolated, and dying by the dozen with every passing minute, surrounded by a debris field so vast and so dense that new Harrow's own sensor operators would later need 3 full days simply to catalog the wreckage. The Absolute Providence itself, the flagship that had carried Threnn through 11 prior campaigns, without ever once taking a hull breach serious enough to threaten its structural integrity, had absorbed 4 separate rail cannon strikes and an estimated 200 drone impacts, its outer armor scorched and cratered along its entire port flank, 3 of its 12 primary shield generators offline, its secondary hangar bay open to vacuum and burning. "Grand Marshal," Vane said, and there was something in his voice now that Threnn had never heard from his second-in-command in 12 years of service together, something that might, in a human officer, have been called grief. "We have lost 281 ships. We have 63 vessels remaining capable of independent maneuver, and enemy forces show no indication of reduced combat tempo. If current attrition rates continue, I estimate total fleet destruction within 11 minutes. Threnn looked at the display for a long moment, and then, slowly, deliberately, in a gesture that felt like tearing something loose from deep eye. Inside his own chest, he did something no Grand Marshal of the Valorian Dominion had done in 11,000 years of recorded military history. He opened a direct channel to the enemy commander and asked, in a voice stripped of every ounce of the confidence he had carried into this system 4 hours earlier, for terms. "Admiral Reyes," he said, and the words came slowly, each one extracted at what felt like enormous cost. "This is Grand Marshal Threnn. I am requesting a cessation of hostilities to discuss terms of surrender." There was a pause on the other end of the channel, and when Reyes's voice returned, it carried, for the first time since the engagement began, something other than flat professional calm. A note of weariness, perhaps, or the particular exhaustion of a commander who had spent 4 years preparing for a battle she had genuinely hoped might never come, and who took no pleasure at all in having been proven right. "Grand Marshal Threnn," she said, "all Dominion vessels are ordered to power down offensive weapon systems and hold position immediately. Any ship that continues firing will be destroyed. Compliance will be verified by drone escort within the next 2 minutes. Do you understand these terms?" "I understand," Threnn said. The order went out across what remained of the Dominion fleet, and one by one, 63 battered, burning warships fell silent, their weapon batteries powering down, their crews staring at tactical displays that told a story none of them had ever imagined they would live to witness. The utter, catastrophic defeat of a fleet that had, at the start of the day, represented the single largest concentration of Dominion military force deployed in this sector of the galaxy in over 2 centuries. New Harrow's stealth fleet closed in around the survivors in a slow, deliberate, unmistakably practiced formation, 300 vessels arranging themselves into an inescapable cordon that made abundantly, brutally clear exactly how thoroughly the ambush had succeeded, and exactly how little choice the surviving Dominion ships had in the matter of their continued existence. The formal surrender took place 4 hours later, transmitted live across every communications frequency New Harrow's networks broadcast on, and though neither Threnn nor Reyes could have known this at the time, quietly intercepted and relayed by no fewer than 6 separate intelligence services belonging to other spacefaring civilizations within transmission range, each of them recording, with mounting and disbelieving fascination, the sight of a fleet that had never before lost a war formally surrendering to a species the Dominion's own intelligence services had rated a Class 5 minimal threat barely 6 hours earlier. Threnn stood on the command dais of the Absolute Providence, its hull still venting atmosphere from a dozen unrepaired breaches, and read the terms of surrender in a voice that had lost every trace of the confident, almost bored certainty he had carried into the system that morning. Full disarmament of all surviving Dominion vessels, complete transfer of navigational and technical data to New Harrow's Joint Colonial Defense Command, and formal acknowledgement, transmitted under Dominion diplomatic seal, that the Valorian Dominion recognized New Harrow and all associated human colonial territories as sovereign and non-tributary, a status no species conquered by the Dominion in 11,000 years had ever previously held. "You could have destroyed us entirely," Threnn said, near the end of the surrender proceedings, in what he would later admit in his own private accounting of the engagement was the single question he most needed answered before he could begin to process what had happened to him and his fleet. "Your weapons, your tactics, you held back. Why?" Admiral Reyes's face, transmitted across the same channel that had carried Threnn's opening ultimatum less than a day earlier, showed no triumph, no satisfaction, nothing resembling the theatrical menace the Dominion's own military culture might have expected from a commander who had just achieved the single greatest military victory in recorded human history. "Because we're not the Dominion, Grand Marshal," she said. "We didn't build this system to conquer anyone. We built it because 4 years ago we found the wreckage of one of your scout drones and realized that someday, something like you was going to show up expecting an easy war. We didn't want an empire. We wanted to make sure nobody ever looked at Earth or any human colony and saw an easy target again. You're alive because killing your entire fleet wouldn't have taught the galaxy anything your surrender won't teach it just as well, and because we'd rather be feared for what we can do than hated for what we did." The message spread, in the weeks and months that followed, far beyond the borders of the Valorian Dominion, carried by the same intelligence services that had quietly recorded the engagement's final hours, retold and reanalyzed in 1,000 briefing rooms across 100 worlds that had, until that day, understood the galaxy's balance of power as a simple, settled hierarchy with the Dominion at its apex, and everyone else arranged in careful, tributary submission beneath it. What those briefing rooms took from the Battle of Kestrel's Reach was not merely the tactical lesson, though the tactical lesson was studied, dissected, and wargamed by every serious military academy in known space for a generation to come, but something harder to quantify and, in its way, far more unsettling. The realization that humanity had built its entire planetary defense doctrine not around raw technological superiority, which the species largely still lacked compared to the Dominion's 11,000-year head start, but around a ruthless, patient, almost artistic understanding of deception, misdirection, and the exploitation of an enemy's own certainty. The Dominion had been beaten not by better weapons, though the weapons had certainly done their terrible work, but by a species that had correctly, coldly calculated exactly how the Dominion would think, exactly what it would assume, and exactly how those assumptions could be turned into a killing ground. In the immediate aftermath of the surrender, as salvage crews from New Harrow's civilian fleet began the long, grim work of recovering what could be recovered from the debris field, bodies, black boxes, fragments of hull plating that would later be displayed, with a certain grim reverence, in a small memorial museum built on the outskirts of Meridian, Admiral Reyes convened a closed briefing with her senior staff aboard the command bunker, and the transcript of that briefing, declassified decades later, reveals a room far more subdued than triumphant. There was no celebration. Commodore Okonkwo would later describe the mood as closer to the exhausted, hollowed-out quiet that follows a natural disaster than the jubilation of a military victory. And Reyes herself, when a junior officer asked whether the colony should begin planning some manner of public commemoration, reportedly replied only that they would commemorate the day they never had to do this again. 4 years of preparation, of diverting scarce colonial resources away from schools and hospitals and agricultural expansion toward rail cannons and stealth hulls and nuclear-pumped lasers that everyone involved had sincerely hoped would never need to be fired, had been vindicated in the span of a single afternoon, and vindication, it turned out, tasted very little like victory. It was this realization, more than the wreckage scattered across New Harrow's orbital space, more than the 63 humiliated Dominion warships being escorted under guard toward the system's jump point, that came to define how the wider galaxy understood humanity in the years that followed. The Galactic Council, that loose and often fractious assembly of the region's older, more established spacefaring powers, convened an emergency session within 3 weeks of the battle's conclusion, and the transcripts of that session, later declassified and studied extensively by human historians, reveal a body far less concerned with humanity's railguns, its nuclear-pumped lasers, or its drone swarms than with something altogether more difficult to counter. A species whose culture of dark humor, restless improvisation, and stubborn, decentralized creativity had apparently produced, in barely 3 centuries, a strategic mind capable of humbling an empire 11,000 years in the making, and had done so not through overwhelming force, but through the patient, almost theatrical construction of an elaborate lie that an entire fleet had walked into without ever once suspecting the trap, until the trap had already closed around them. It was not humanity's ships the Council feared, in the end. It was the plain, unavoidable fact that a species capable of building this deception could, given enough time and enough provocation, build 100 more like it, and that no one, not even the Dominion's most seasoned military minds, had yet found a reliable way to guess what such a species might do next. Grand Marshal Voss'Kalar Threnn returned to Valos Prime in disgrace, his fleet a fraction of its former strength, his career effectively ended by a single afternoon's engagement against an enemy his own intelligence services had assured him posed no meaningful threat at all. He would spend the remainder of his life, by his own later admission in a memoir published under Dominion censorship review some years afterward, turning over the same question in his mind, again and again, without ever finding an answer that satisfied him. Not how New Harrow had built its weapons, which was, in the end, a matter of industrial capacity and technical ingenuity the Dominion could study and eventually replicate, but how a species so young, so fractious, so apparently undisciplined by the standards of an 11,000-year-old empire, had understood the Dominion's own psychology so completely, had anticipated its arrogance so precisely, that the entire battle had been won before the first Valorian ship ever dropped out of hyperspace above New Harrow's sky. He never did find a satisfying answer. But somewhere in the vast archives of the Dominion's Bureau of Xenological Assessment, a single classification code was quietly, permanently revised, struck through and replaced with a new designation that would, in the decades to come, appear beside the word human, in the threat assessments of a dozen different galactic powers, a designation that carried with it none of the old certainty, none of the old contempt, only a wary, hard-earned respect that no empire in that region of the galaxy would ever again take for granted, unknown and unpredictable, and above all else, never, under any circumstances, to be underestimated again. The Galactic Council's emergency session, convened in the cavernous, echoing debate chamber of the Council's ancient orbital seat above the neutral world of Kithron, ran for 11 days, far longer than any prior session in the Council's recorded history, and the delegates who filed in and out of that chamber carried with them recordings, transcripts, and salvaged sensor logs from the Battle of Kestrel's Reach that would be studied, replayed, and argued over in 100 subsequent closed-door sessions for years afterward. What unsettled the assembled delegates most was not any single weapon New Harrow had deployed, though the nuclear-pumped lasers in particular prompted a flurry of urgent proposals for new arms control frameworks that would, in the end, go nowhere, blocked by a Dominion delegation too proud to admit it had any interest in limiting a technology it now desperately wanted to reverse engineer for itself. What unsettled them was the pattern beneath the weapons, a species that had, by every metric the Council's own analysts used to measure civilizational maturity, been young, fractured, and technologically unremarkable, and had nonetheless produced a defensive doctrine so thoroughly grounded in the psychology of its enemy that the enemy's own certainty had become the primary weapon used against it. Delegate after delegate rose to note, with varying degrees of alarm, that humanity had not won by being stronger. It had won by being patient, by being willing to spend years building a lie so complete that an empire 11,000 years old had walked into it without a moment's hesitation, and a species capable of that kind of patience, that kind of cold, disciplined foresight, was not a species whose next move could be predicted by any existing model the Council's war colleges had ever built. In the years that followed, New Harrow's population grew, slowly and then quickly, as word of the colony's defense spread and settlers from across human space petitioned to relocate to what had become, almost overnight, the most secure address in the sector. Admiral Reyes never did receive the parade her staff had once quietly joked about, back in the tense, uncertain months before the Dominion fleet's arrival. But she did receive, some years later, a formal visit from a Dominion diplomatic envoy carrying an offer of trade normalization, an offer New Harrow's government accepted on terms considerably more favorable than any the Dominion had ever previously extended to a species it had once attempted to conquer. Grand Marshal Threnn was not aboard that envoy's ship, having been quietly retired from active command in the months following his return to Valos Prime, his name recorded in Dominion military history not as a villain exactly, but as something the old Valorian officer caste found almost harder to forgive. A cautionary tale, the man who had looked at a Class 5 minimal threat and seen, too late, the shape of the only enemy in 11,000 years the Dominion had never truly defeated. And across 100 worlds, in briefing rooms and war colleges and quiet diplomatic corridors where the future of the galaxy's balance of power was endlessly, anxiously discussed, one lesson from Kestrel's reach outlasted all the others, repeated so often in so many languages that it eventually needed no attribution at all. That the most dangerous thing about humanity was never going to be the size of its fleets or the power of its weapons, but the simple, terrifying fact that no one anywhere could ever quite be certain what a human being, patient, inventive, and utterly unbothered by the weight of 11,000 years of someone else's history, might decide to build next.